Hello and welcome to the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Our guest today is Lance Pettiford. He's an art director and a design consultant, but he's also a funk enthusiast. And we're talking about funk music today, R&B funk music. And the reason we're doing this subject today, we're kind of veering off the path a little bit today, is because recently we've lost a lot of people who were very influential in the R&B music industry in the 70s. And I want to talk about how that funk influence has been part of what we're, so much a part of what we're hearing today, as far as rap music goes, as far as today's R&B goes. So Lance Pettiford, welcome to the show.
How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Lance, I want to start off by talking about the fact that we recently lost James Mtume. Of course, he's not getting the publicity that a Betty White is getting for passing away, but we know that he was very, very influential, especially in the Northeast states when it comes to the sound of music. You may remember him, or people may remember him from You, Me, and He, songs like Juicy Fruit, but he had a very special influence on music in that area. Can you talk about that a little bit? Let's start off there.
Yeah, I became familiar with James Mtume actually as a jazz artist. I didn't really, but I really didn't get to listen to him until, he came out in the early 80s. But because I'm always interested in the background of musicians, I knew he had that jazz influence, and that he played with Miles Davis and did a lot of session work also with other jazz musicians.
There were also a lot of groups from that time who were influenced by jazz. You think of folks like Brass Construction, Crown Heights Affair.
All local people. Local Northeastern people, yeah.
But a lot of those folks were influenced by the jazz and also that Latin sound that came from up north as well. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, groups like the first group that comes to mind is Mandrell, and the Wilson brothers, who were from Panama, who influenced, I remember hearing a interview on PFW, and they talked about how other groups would come to see them, in the late 60s, like George Clinton and Kool and the Gang would kind of check them out and listen to what they were doing and seeing how their performance was. And I think, that's another group that's popular, but I feel like they don't really get the credit that they deserve.
You're talking about Mandrell.
Mandrell, yeah.
Now, when people think about funk, a lot of times the first group that comes to mind is George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic, who was, of course, you got to give them their props. They were extremely influential when it came to music, but their influence wasn't just jazz, it was rock as well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and we got to talk about James Brown too, because James Brown's like the godfather of soul, but also of funk. And many of the musicians who ended up playing with Parliament and Funkadelic were, members of the JBs in the beginning. You got Bootsy Collins and his brother Catfish, and then you have what became the Horny Horns, was basically the horn section of the JBs back in the day. So yeah, Parliament Funkadelic. I got to give it up to James Brown for setting the blueprint for everybody.
And you know what I love about whenever I've watched documentaries about James Brown and his influence, James Brown came from nothing. I mean, he is definitely an American story of success, and how he was such a perfectionist, and how he founded some of the sounds that we're hearing today. Here we are 40 and 50 years later, and that sound that James Brown founded is still significant today.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. And he was influenced by others. Little Richard was probably a big influence and helped him out in the beginning. So, the blueprint is big in R&B, which ended up becoming funk and just went into hip hop. Just created a whole genre for our experience, Black experience, and what we contributed to the music industry.
What do you think about the fact that back then they had these huge bands that had like dozens of people in the band, but the good thing is everybody had to know how to play an instrument, had to know how to sing. You had these big horn sections.
Right.
And these tremendous artists back then. How do you feel about how those artists, those horn sections, those drummers, how they influenced music in that time?
Oh man, it's something we take for granted, and you may relate to this, because back in the day, like kids, it was mandatory to take music, right? And that's the big change now is kids, it's not mandatory because it's not being funded. So, we take it for granted, but, a lot of kids knew music, just as you did, you grew up with it and you learned it through school, you learned the basics and you took classes. But, kids nowadays, that's a luxury, whereas we had that opportunity to be able to do that, get the basics and learn from each other.
And I know my brother had a band, and I can't even tell you how many times they were out in the garage playing day after day after day after day. They were one of the groups who didn't make it. But
Right.
there were a lot of groups out there with some really incredible musicians. I know one of the guys in my brother's band, Michael Freeman, I mean, you would think that you were listening to Jimi Hendrix. That's how talented he was. I'm talking about playing with his teeth, all kinds of stuff. There were some really talented musicians out there, and it seems like that piece of it is kind of lost nowadays. And I agree, one of the reasons is they don't emphasize music in school the way they did.
Right. And now for us, a lot of us, we I know because I'm a real active member of my church, that's where the musicians are. I mean, they've always been there, but that's where you find them because, that's where you get those opportunities to play and learn. Whereas, like I said, we learned in school or, and took private lessons, but the guys I teeter at the guitar, I tell people I'm not a guitar player, I play at it. But, I learned from those guys who sat in the garage. I would sit and watch them and go home and try to figure out what they were doing. And then eventually took lessons, but I didn't stick with it. But, I have that basic foundation of music that a lot of kids miss. And like I said, it's sort of a privilege to be able to do that now.
And also, it wasn't just the music. I don't know if you remember the album covers from back in the day. And as an art designer, as an art director, creative director, I'm sure you can relate to this. Albums like the Ohio Players, they had some classic album covers that just span over time, that they still look good today. I remember I was showing my kids some of those incredible creative album covers. One of my favorite was Honey. I don't know what your favorite cover was from back in the day.
Oh man, well, as a graphic designer, there have been times I've given talks and I start out with my influence, and my biggest influence is because I was into music, and the reason I got into graphic design was because of album covers. So I would say that the key person that kind of made me really want to do this is Pedro Bell, who did all the Funkadelic covers. They were these crazy illustrations within illustrations. And what's interesting is that, a lot of graffiti artists kind of take their hats off to him, but for me, he was a big influence. A lot of people don't realize what an influence he had on art, and actually, he was a part of the music, so that even helped. And visually, you know, I was just intrigued with all of those album covers. The Ohio Players, even a lot of jazz album covers, like the Blue Note covers, I was influenced by. But I just remember Warner Brothers; they always spent big budgets on album covers, and I remember the Chaka Khan cover, with her sitting on the lip pillow. I mean,
Yes.
that's just
That is an absolute classic. What is your favorite? I know one of my favorites is Stevie Wonder's covers. Oh gosh, of songs in the key of life. And I remember his covers were very creative as well. And that was such a big thing. Isaac Hayes, when he's on the cover with the long chain and the open shirt. And I mean, he just exemplified manhood in the 70s. What are some of your other favorites?
Oh man. I got to give a shout out to Anthony Barboza, who he's a photographer, black photographer. He shot a lot of those covers back in the day, and I didn't know until I started following him on Instagram. But yeah, Isaac Hayes with the chains, and the woman that was on the cover with the bald head, was on the Ohio Player cover. Anthony Barboza, I believe he shot those covers too. I mean, I don't have one particular favorite, but I mean, there's just so many.
Lance, how do you think those covers were able to capture the sound of the album? How do you think they were able to do that level of creativity?
I guess just being lovers of the music, I know that, it's a marketing tool. So a lot of times, they'll have this vision for what the album should be. And, they go out and try to execute it in the best way possible. I remember I did a cover shoot with George Clinton and for BET Weekend magazine, and I actually had an opportunity to have a conversation with him about the Flashlight cover, and he told me how they just decided on set to open up the camera lens. If you look at that cover, it's a time exposure, and it's like this blur of him on the cover. And he talked about that, and I thought that was really cool that I was able to have an opportunity to chat with him about that. And then, talk about Pedro Bell and the influence that his music had on me, and had an opportunity to even have my name on the back of one of the album covers under the fan club. And he told me how, there were other people on there famous, like Africa Bambaataa, who, is like the godfather of hip hop, and just music and the art all go together. I mean, it's all art, right? So you're talking about the visual aspect of it and the sound of it.
Lance, when it comes to today's music, I remember when sampling first came out, and I found myself, I absolutely hated it. But over the years, my kids have kind of gotten me to realize that that's kind of a new form of sound. We've kind of normalized sampling now. But I used to say, well, why don't you get your own sound? Why don't you create your own sound? Why are you taking from James Brown? Why are you taking from George Clinton? Why don't you create your own? And they showed me the creativity, or they've pointed out the creativity within that creativity. What do you think about today's music and how it was influenced by music from back then?
Well, we were all influenced. We were just influenced in different ways, right? So, like, for example, a lot of the guitar players, because that's what I like, they were influenced by the blues musicians, right? So when you have this genre of music come out called hip hop, and they sample, when you learned a lick, you play the guitar, or you wanted the piano, or you wanted to sing a certain way, you emulated who you wanted to sound like, right? And eventually you made that part of who you were. That became your aesthetic. So I feel like it's the same with hip hop. They take those sounds, except they're actually using them, you know, and using them in a different way. And I think it's good for music. You know, I think it carries it in a different way, takes it in another direction, and it makes it our own. You know,
And
you know,
it's
you know, the whole cultural Black experience is, you know, we've taken from other cultures, and cultures have taken from us, and we've built this thing, and made it our own in this country, right? So it's the same with music, I feel, and you know, it continues to evolve. Some of it, you know, I don't like. You know, I don't like the direction of you know, lyrically or with the content, but you know, that's a part of it, right? You know, and it just continues to evolve. And then you'll have people that become more conscious about it, like Kendrick Lamar's, who, you know, I kind of have a lot of respect for, and they take it somewhere else. So, yeah. I mean,
he's one of my, Kendrick Lamar is one of my favorites. He's on my playlist when I go out for runs every day. I always have one of his songs is on my playlist for that day for when I do my exercise. Also, it's good to see that a lot of the old school artists, such as Bootsy Collins, are very much involved in the development of the young folks. They're working with the young folks in keeping that sound alive. So
right.
let's talk about that too. And before Betty Wright died, she had been instrumental as well in helping some R&B groups along with their sound and helping to keep that funk, that R&B sound alive.
Yeah, I think that's good. You know, they basically are mentoring these young musicians who have a lot of respect for their music, you know, and they want them involved in some sort of way, you know. You know, I know Snoop Dogg, you know, has done stuff with Bootsy and, you know, just tons of other people, and it's a good way to pay homage to those musicians and, you know, pass that knowledge on to them.
And yesterday we were talking about ways in which they're involved in things and people don't know that might be Bootsy. I know he was on an Old Navy commercial a couple of years back, and I said, is that Bootsy Collins? And
Exactly.
Absolutely it was. And just some voices you hear in commercials and things like, it's these people, and you don't really realize until you hear it a couple of times, and you may never put one and one together, but they're still out there.
Yeah, they're still out there. They may not be performing, you know, live, but they definitely behind the scenes doing stuff, you know. And a lot of people don't know. Like I remember, you know, listening to other, you know, we were talking earlier about podcasts, and you know, someone I listen to a lot is Questlove, and he has all of these people on there, and he's one who pays homage to a lot of old R&B artists and funk artists, and you know, like Ray Parker Jr., who's, you know, still out there and, you know, behind the scenes doing stuff. Or Patrice Rushen, who, you know, she even had a couple of funk tunes, you know.
Yes, Forget Me Not. What are you talking about?
Yeah, right, exactly. So, and you know, she's another one that's behind the scenes. You don't hear about her a lot, but she's behind the scenes doing a whole lot of stuff.
You know, also regional artists. We started off the conversation by talking about James Mtume, who was in the Northeast. There were also a lot of influences from the West Coast as well. Before the West Coast rap rivalry, there were also big groups coming out of the West, like Sly and the Family Stone, for example, who were very influential.
Yeah, and the group War, like, come on now, you can't even talk about funk without talking about War.
And so War was out of the West Coast sound as well.
Yeah.
And were very, very influential. Now let's talk about, we talked about funk and a lot of stuff coming from the blues. There was a lot of people, including Rick James, came from more of a rock background. before
Right.
entering into R&B. There's a lot of good documentaries, by the way, out there that talks about people like Rick James and Parliament Funkadelic and other folks who were very influential. But Rick James, who was out for a long time before he ever really made a #1 hit, but he sang with rock groups. He worked with a lot of
Neil
rock
Young.
artists.
Yeah, he was in a group with Neil Young. They were on Motown together in a group. You know, Neil Young, the rock artist, which is interesting.
And did you
Yeah.
find, because you were interested in guitar, did you hear that influence as well, how that rock influenced R&B and influenced the funk as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it kind of started, hearing who we talked about, Michael Freeman, hearing him play, right? And it's like, hearing the Isley Brothers, right? And then I remember hearing Ernie Isley. It's like, I ain't never heard anybody play the guitar like that. And then it was like, well, wait a minute. I went back to Jimi Hendrix, and I became a big Jimi Hendrix fan. Who also I think had a big influence on a lot of particularly Parliament Funkadelic. I believe he had a big influence on in that sound. That Band of Gypsies album. No black people listen to. I remember listening to a documentary, and Lenny Kravitz said, no black person would ever listen to Hendrix, but when the Band of Gypsies album came out, the live album, and had Buddy Miles on it, all of a sudden it was this funky beat going on, and you hear that in everybody's house, that particular album.
You mentioned Ernie Isley, who, of course, was influenced by Jimi Hendrix. I remember they did a tribute to the Isley Brothers. This was a couple of years back. One of the shows, it may have been the BET Awards or Essence or something like that. And they did a tribute to him. He got up and they played Summer Breeze. And he did that guitar riff at the end of, which I used to play over and over again as a kid. I would go down the basement and that would be on loop, and I would play that over and over again dozens of times. Lance, it sounded like he had just recorded that the day before. He sounded just as good or better than he did on the actual record. What an incredibly talented guitarist, Ernie Isley, who may never get the recognition of a Jimi Hendrix, but an incredible artist and incredible influence.
Yeah, and also, speak of guitar players, like Eddie Hazel, who played with Parliament Funkadelic, whose signature song was Maggot Brain, right? And is always on it when they have the top 100 influential guitarists. He's always on there. He's always on that list, but a lot of people don't know who he is. But musicians know who he is, but like general public may not know.
And he absolutely was influential, and so were so many others. But with R&B, you don't think of guitarists as much as you think of other instruments. Why is that? Is it because there were so many white guitarists who kind of overshadowed that? Why is it that when we think of R&B, we don't think of those great guitarists like Ernie Isley? Also, Confunction, and I don't know, I think it's from Michael Cooper or one of, but there were some great guitarists in those larger bands like Confunction as well.
I don't know. I kind of feel like they weren't out front as
Eric Clapton
the
and
rock, they weren't like the front men for their groups either, right? It was more about the band. I kind of feel like, but I think of all these guitar players that I listen to, like Tony Maiden. I believe it's Tony Maiden who played with Rufus. He was excellent, a real good guitar player. There were a lot. Curtis Mayfield. He was an incredible guitar player.
Who knew?
Who actually influenced? Jimi Hendrix was influenced by him. And I remember listening to an interview, and they were saying Billy Cox, who played bass for Jimi Hendrix, said that the song "Little Wing" was influenced by Curtis Mayfield's sound. So Jimmy wanted to do a song similar to what Curtis would have done. Bobby Womack, we don't think about him, but he was an excellent guitar player.
Now, you just told me, and I guess that's the purpose of this show, you just told me two things I never knew: Curtis Mayfield and Bobby Womack. I did not know that. Of course, we think of them as great vocalists, especially Bobby Womack with that deep Southern grits and gravy sound. You don't think of him in terms of being a musician. You think of him more as a vocalist.
Yep. But yeah, they were excellent guitar players. And I just heard recently that Al Green could play the guitar. And there's one particular song, I can't remember which song it is, but they made him, the musicians, I can't remember the musicians' names. They were a team of brothers. It kind of influenced that sound of Al Green, and their name escapes me right now. But in an interview, one of them said that Al was kind of messing around on the guitar, and they said, hey, we want to record that in the song. And he was like, no, I'm not good enough. But they went ahead and recorded it, and he's playing it. After this, I have to figure out which song it is. But yeah, Al Green apparently was a good guitar player.
Well, in these last few minutes of the show, let's talk about where we go from here, how we keep that sound alive. And I hope there are enough folks out there who are doing just that. For my kids, they talk about Bruno Mars is bringing back the soul, bringing back the funk, one of the artists who is making music that actually is reminiscent of those 70s and 80s. Where do you think we go from here in your view?
Yeah, I think, it's the next generation, those influences who have come along. Yeah, Bruno Mars, I mean, he's kind of major. But, a lot of people we don't hear about, like, there's a group called Soul Live. They're keeping that sound alive, and they've got a branch group called Lettuce, and, they're doing their thing. So there's a whole genre of musicians that aren't so, not on the Bruno Mars level, but, in music, tour a lot and do a lot of good things to keep the music alive.
And music was such a huge part of our growing up. And I made that a huge part of my children as well. They all play instruments. They're all music lovers. Each one loves a different genre, but they're all music lovers. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. We've been talking to Lance Pettiford. He's an art director and a design consultant, and he's also, for the sake of disclosure, we're also related. He's my cousin. Thank you so much. And we enjoyed the funk together for many years growing up in Vauxhall, New Jersey. Lance grew up in Rahway, but his grandparents lived in Vauxhall, and we were always together. Our family loved music, loved the sound, loved the funk. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lance Pettiford.
It was great being here. Enjoyed the conversation. I know we could continue on and on, but
I gotta go. All right. Thank you so much for watching the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Enjoy the rest of your day.